I would like to welcome you to this webinar organized by the Royal Society of South Africa and co-hosted with the Academy of Science of South Africa. The Royal Society of South Africa welcomes new members and student members, so if you're interested in science or curious about the world of science, please consider becoming a member. An online membership application form can be found on our website. In recent time, we have welcomed 3 new members, Dr. Frederick Odon-Ayo, Dr. Fatima Khan, and Dr. Aya Rane. Today's talk is entitled Science Communication, Information and Ethics, the role of expert scientists in leading discussion and ensuring integrity. So Stephanie Burton is professor in biochemistry and professor at Future Africa at the University of Pretoria. She is also immediate past vice principal for research and postgraduate education at UP, having served in that role from 2011 to 2020. Among her many roles, she is the president and a fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa and vice president of the Academy of Science of South Africa. Stephanie holds an MSc in organic chemistry and a PhD in biochemistry from Rhodes University, which she obtained in 1994. Her academic career started in biochemistry and biotechnology at Rhodes University and led her via the University of Cape Town and the Cape Peninsula University of Technology to her current UP appointment. Her research interests are in sustainability, applied biochemistry, and biotechnology, and she has published widely and supervised numerous postgraduate students. She also has a strong interest in research capacity development and research ethics and integrity, and she serves on several national bodies related to research and doctoral training. She is recognized for her leadership in managing research strategy and performance, postgraduate training, innovation activities, open science, science communication initiatives, and internationalization programs. It is therefore my great pleasure to hand the virtual floor to Stephanie. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bert, and thank you to all of you for being here. And thank you also to the Royal Society and to ASA, the Academy, for the invitation to give this presentation. I'm going to do it through a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to share my screen now, which is going to take a second or two, but it won't take long. Right, there we are. I'm assuming you can all see that and that you can hear me. Sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water. That doesn't happen to me very often. So, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope you're going to find this interesting. It really comes from my interest in how we've been communicating over the last few years, in particular, about our science. So I'm going to talk about this from a number of different points of view. I'm talking about it, first of all, because of my role in the Royal Society and the Academy of Sciences, where we speak often about the work that people are doing, the science that people are providing. And of course, it also comes from that career in science and research and academic leadership, where it has been always very important to be able to communicate and to do that in an ethical way. I just want to make one comment about that academic career, and that is that all through an academic career, one competes, you cooperate, you participate and collaborate, and latterly as a leader, you enable other people to do their research. And there's always that plan in the back of our minds, all of us, that we have a plan to change the world. Well, our world was changed for us very dramatically a couple of years ago. And the question in my mind has been, how are we responding to that as scientists? So the topic that I'm talking about is about science communication and information and ethics and research integrity. And let us start, as all good researchers do, with the definition. This is the International Science Council definition of science, being the pursuit of knowledge. And there are 2 key concepts in that. The first one is that science is based on knowledge and understanding of the world. And secondly, that understanding comes from a systematic methodology which is based on evidence. You'll hear me speak about that a few times during this talk. And I'm going to focus on two key areas. The first is research and production of new knowledge, and the other is on communication of that information. You'll see those threads come through the rest of this talk now. So let's start with research. Why do we do research? You know, in this world, which is fragile, very vulnerable, and certainly at the moment under very constrained resources, why are we doing research? Well, the answer is we do research because we need to generate new knowledge. And we do that because we need to find answers to questions. And the questions are there to solve problems and to address the challenges that we are facing in this 21st century in a digital and very much information-driven world. So the research that we do is needed to create impact. Sorry. And we need to make sure that that impact is not just about new knowledge, but also about innovation and the benefit to society. So how we conduct our research matters. We say, very glibly sometimes, science is public good. That means that we believe that it is valuable. And we respect the legal protection of that knowledge and intellectual property, and we acknowledge the intrinsic rights of society to that knowledge at the same time. In other words, society has a right to know what that knowledge is that we have generated. Those other concepts that I'm just going to mention are about research integrity. What do we mean by that? Well, that's about how we do our research, what we do with the data, how we use secondary data. That's data that somebody else has generated. And then how do we know that what we're doing with that data is ethical? The other part of it is how we communicate. That's how we publish, and I mean publish in the broadest sense. It's not just about paper publishing, but of course how we broadcast all of the information that we have, where we publish it, who pays for it to be published, and who has access to it. So that all means that research integrity is about sound ethical conduct. It's about how we do the research, what we do with the data. And the question comes up of how do we know what is ethical? Well, ethics has to do with respecting rights and with responsibilities. With respect to respecting rights, you can list many different rights, and here's a few. These come from my own institution's policy on ethical research. But the rights of the researcher are about academic freedom and having an environment which allows them to do their research, freedom from discrimination and abuse, and there are many other rights that are involved in conducting research. And at the same time, we accept responsibility for what we do, and there are many different kinds of responsibilities as well. Here's a list in terms of social responsibility and justice, benevolence towards other people, professionalism. You could probably add many other responsibilities, for example, management of research. Those two are two sides of a coin, which are parts of ethical research. So how do we know? How do we set the standards which we can believe in terms of ethics and ethical research without going into the depth of philosophy which underlies this, taking a very pragmatic view here of how do we set standards for the ethics in our research? Well, the first, of course, is that we have a very elaborate system of ethics approvals and management of that. Globally, nationally, at institutional level, we have regulations, policies, many policies, and many important global regulations which govern how we manage, and then in order to put that into practice, committees and processes. In our own context, we have various national councils and committees who oversee what happens at different institutions, and they're not all universities, of course, but many research organizations. So along with the rules and regulations that we invent and impose on ourselves comes the necessity for monitoring compliance, and that's the other role of ethics management. And we still ask ourselves, how can we be sure? There is not a DVC in the world who has not spent sleepless nights worrying about the research which is being done in their universities and similarly other institutions. We have to try to be sure, but there are always incidents, where research is not conducted completely ethically, and then we have systems to deal with that in terms of disciplinary actions and correction. The other part of that is training for ethical research and research integrity, and we have programs in all institutions and all sorts of organizations at many levels, in a university, undergraduate student modules, programs for postgraduate students, for researchers, refresher courses, community information sessions, and the latter are very important, I think, in terms of reassuring our communities broadly that we are seeking to maintain research integrity. Then there's research data management. I'll mention this a few times, but that's about managing the data that is generated in the course of research. It needs to be collated and saved and archived, and most importantly, we need to provide appropriate access to it. And that comes with confidentiality, it comes with the protection of intellectual property and many other different ways of regarding data. Along with that, the fourth aspect of all of this is the responsible reporting and exploitation of our data. And I will say more about that. But the operative word there is responsible, making sure that we report appropriately, as I have already alluded to before. Turning to the future, we are in the information era and under the impact of digital technologies, particularly. Things have changed enormously in the last few decades. So that issue that I just mentioned about managing research data has become increasingly important and increasingly, I might say, and unmanageable in some ways. The world is generating data at an astounding rate. More and more data becomes available every second. There are many ways in which it is published and in which it is accessed. What is becoming a trend is that publicly funded research information is required to be available publicly and usually digitally, to be accessible to the broad public, to see the data and to see the information which comes from it. If you balance that with the need for protection of, for example, confidentiality, we need global systems for managing that research data. It's not sufficient simply to have an institutional system to manage it, but we need a coordinated and interlinked network of global systems which allow us to manage all of the research data which is available. And when I think about that, I sometimes thank my lucky stars that I'm not an information scientist. It is certainly a very big question at the moment as to how we manage data and how we protect the people whose data that is. I don't think I can overemphasize the importance of managing data, and I think it's something that we are still getting used to in the last few decades. And then there's the issue of new technologies, which are posing new questions all the time. Artificial intelligence, for example. Is artificial intelligence, or my colleagues in information sciences tell me there are many artificial intelligences, and I understand that, so let us use the plural. Will artificial intelligences help us, for example, in detecting fraudulent data and plagiarism? Will we trust artificial intelligences to tell us when our data is incorrect or when there is plagiarism? And will we ethically allow artificial intelligences to do research, for example, with literature search?
Made of cauliflower.
Could I maybe just ask everybody to just mute their microphones? Thank you. And then there's the big question about how we can ethically allow our students to use automation and artificial intelligences to help them with their learning and to find information. We must ask ourselves what they will learn, and will they learn? Or will they simply believe and fall into the traps of the internet era? And I will come back to that question in a moment. So, about reporting our research then. We understand and accept that our research results should be reported to the global community, because this is the new knowledge that we've produced, and this is the learning that's been achieved. So we know we need to report it, and we need to do that actively. The research we've done and the outcomes need to be proactively shared as widely as possible in order for it to contribute meaningfully and for the good of society, and I might say in time to be good for the society and for the planet. Those results, of course, also need to be available for translation into action to benefit society and to contribute to new development. And again, timing is important there as much as what the results are. So going back to publishing, in fact, if you think about it, if we don't publish, or at least in some way publish, there's not much point in conducting the research. And if our relevant stakeholders don't have an opportunity to understand that new knowledge and use it, how will they benefit from it? And if the broader community doesn't benefit, then we and they might rightfully ask, what is the value and what is the impact of the research that we are doing? So making it available is as important as doing it. And the responsibility of scientists is to ensure that society understands the research and the benefits of that research. And highlighted there is the fact that we need to make sure that in publishing our research, we do it clearly and accurately and honestly. That's a part of what I said I was going to talk about in this talk. And if I say nothing else, I think that's one of the most important points to be made, is that it is our responsibility to make sure that we publish and we make our work understood clearly and honestly. One of my favorite quotations is this one, and Marcus Quintilianus was a philosopher, an ancient Roman philosopher, about 35 years after Christ, and that is his quotation that you probably have seen before, one of my favorites, that we should not write so as to make sure that readers understand us, but to make sure that it is impossible for the reader to misunderstand. I think that's a very important concept, and it's certainly one that I tell all of my students. It's the same for the public. So when we publish our science and we think about how we publish ethically, we have the research data, we have the results, the conclusions, and all that new knowledge that we've generated. And then there are a few emerging trends which are important about publishing ethically. There's the movement towards open access, and I'm aware that most of this audience know about open access, but just to be clear, I refer to the movement, the global movement, which is a move from paying to read research, essentially to paying to publish it. We call that open access because as a result of that movement and the placing of our research on open platforms, then the access to it, the access to read it, and to see what it is that we've been doing as researchers is open to everybody. Everybody who looks at those platforms can see the work without having to pay for it. As I say, that's a global movement. It's one which is at the moment in a transition, and many of us are very involved in the international discussions around that on behalf of our country. But we are no different from the rest of the world. Open access is coming, and it is critical, I think, in the way in which research is going because of our responsibility to our public, to our community. There's also a new trend which has really emerged, particularly in the last couple of years and often related to the pandemic. And that is the movement away from the tradition of peer review as we know it. Traditionally, academic publishing has involved peer review by a small number of selected reviewers who are considered to be experts in the field, and their opinions govern whether or not the research is in fact published. But there is a trend now to publishing online prior to review, because you can. So you can put a publication, an article, a report on an open platform and indicate that it has not yet been reviewed, had not yet been reviewed in the traditional sense. And then you can use what is that new part of that new movement, and that is the response of interested parties to the publication, to the report before review. And in some people's opinions, that is in fact a more objective way of having your research reviewed, because the people who are looking at it when it is first put online may in fact be more critical or more informed than those who might have been asked to review it in the conventional system. So publication online is moving very rapidly And there are statistics which show that there are millions, literally millions, of publications that have been put online in the last few years without yet having been reviewed. There is, of course, a question there about how we manage quality and how we ensure the honesty and the accuracy of those publications. I think that that will shake itself down in due course. And then there's another trend, which is a very disturbing one, and that is the unethical practice of publication in predatory journals, paying to have an article published in a journal that is not necessarily of any academic standing and has not had that reliable and credible peer review of any sort before the science is reported. The problem there is that there's no basis for ensuring that that research has met our internationally accepted standards for truth and meaning and value. And that can lead to some very tenuous conclusions. Somebody reading that research, which is not necessarily reviewed in any way, may in fact draw some very tenuous conclusions. And then there are the issues of fraudulent data which is simply false, and that is simply dishonest. We have ways of dealing with that in the scientific world. But there's also weak data, weak in inverted commas, meaning data which has not really been collected on the basis of a good hypothesis, or there's a good question, there's a lack perhaps of intellectual depth, technical depth, or no sound basis for the work that has been done in terms of scientific understanding. All of these are contradictory to ethical publishing, and they do undermine the genuineness of the publishing that we do seek to do. So that ethical publishing thing, well, there's another part to it that's also very important. In this world where we have completely open access to a lot of information, which is available on the internet, and that is where we tend to go. We all do it. We go to Google, we go to Wikipedia, we go to ask the internet for information. Scientific reports and publications are available to be accessed by any reader who happens to be searching for information related to any topic that might be published. And in this world, which is so information-driven, there is a tendency to think that whatever is available on the internet is true. We say it ourselves, and we hear people saying it. I found it in Wikipedia. I found it on the internet. The danger there lies in that there may be just disingenuous misrepresentation, but it's also very misleading, particularly to the naive reader, the reader who is not a seasoned academic, for example, who can look at this information, perhaps encounter unfounded assertions, and then this is the real danger, they may act upon them. And there are a multitude of possible unfortunate consequences of that. Let us take the example of the advice to drink bleach in order to avoid being infected with the COVID-19 disease. That's just one, and a very obvious one, but there are many possible unfortunate consequences. So let us turn to that one. Let us turn to the information and science communication issue around the pandemic. I put the picture up because this immediately brings to all of our minds the issue of the coronavirus, which is the cause of the current pandemic. And here's the message for right now. The message that we need to convey and believe is that we must accept that the inevitable truth is that viruses are here to stay, and the coronavirus, which causes COVID-19, is here to stay. It will become endemic. What we mean by that is that it's not going to go away as a virus. It's going to stay. And it will stay around for as long as we can imagine. We don't quite know what the pattern is of the pandemic and how it will end, where it will end, if it will end. But there are a few other things that we know. There's been a number of surveys which have shown that we, in general, understand more and more about how viruses broadly change their virulence, if you like, but they tend not to disappear entirely. We also know that viral epidemics will continue to occur in future. Other viruses will become epidemics. And that's going to be exacerbated by the environment, pressure on the environment and on biodiversity. That's where many of these diseases come from, the so-called zoonotic diseases, which are those which are transmitted from animals and become infectious to humans. And of course, climate change is going to contribute further impact to the pressure on the environment, to the pressure on biodiversity, and therefore to the kind of epidemics that we will encounter in future. The world wasn't prepared for this pandemic, and we certainly need to think about that and consider how we can be prepared for what are inevitably future epidemics. So how do we address that inevitable? Well, there are three key responses to it. The first thing is that we need to communicate. We need everybody to understand that viruses are almost forever. We need everybody to understand what they are and what epidemics are and how they arise. And everybody needs to have the information that they require in order to live safely through the future of new epidemics. The next thing is that we need to develop resilience and adaptability. We need to learn how to live differently. And the third thing is that we need then to use the opportunities for innovation, for development, which requires innovation, in order to improve life as we go forward. And all of those three responses require information. So what is the information that people are asking for? Well, they're looking for answers to questions, and the obvious ones are, what's a virus? What's a vaccine? How are we going to get this disease? How are we going to cope? But actually, if you look at what underpins those questions, the questions are, what should we believe? Which news is correct? Well, who should we believe? What should we be doing differently? And how should we be changing our thinking? These are the questions that underlie so many of the questions that we see, particularly in the social media, but also in many other contexts. So what is the information that we need to be providing? Well, we need facts. We need understandable and accurate facts made available to the general public. We need evidence-based information because that's believable. That's going to allow us to formulate reasonable expectations and tell us what are our options for the future. So all of that comes with a need for a greater science culture in the world, more awareness, more understanding of what science is telling us. We need increased educational awareness programs, scientifically sound and accessible information. And I quote here one of many thousands of papers which have been written about exactly that, about how we need to understand more and how we need to make that available to our communities. But there's something else as well, and that is that we need to have reasons to trust the information that is available and to trust the people who are providing it, which is us, the scientists. How much more information do we need? Oh, there's plenty of information. There are dozens and dozens of studies, for example, on pandemic preparedness. There have been 12 international panels and 14 reports in the last few months. This is one example on how to prepare for pandemics that are coming up. And there's more data being presented every day. Those of you who use social media will be very familiar with these pictures. Every morning, we take a look at these pictures and we look for the trends in the information that is available, the data that is coming at us very rapidly all the time. People need to know how to access that information, and they need to know what to believe. They need to understand how the information is changing and why it's changing. This is an example of that. Not long ago, I put this poster up on my own personal Facebook page because I thought it was informative and I thought it would help with all these issues about people wondering about vaccines and all the myths about vaccines. I put it up, and within a few hours, I had several comments from colleagues and friends who looked at it and said, well, yeah, but this is just a bit more information and it'll change and we don't necessarily know whether we should believe it or not. The point is that science does change because the evidence changes. And this is another example of a tweet where a researcher was saying scientists change their minds because the evidence changes. And it's difficult for us to understand why the public doesn't like that. But the point is, we are trying to put across the message that they should listen to the scientists and trust the experts. I think we have a responsibility in terms of being the scientists and being the experts to be trusted. So who is it who's providing that information and who's receiving it? Well, here's part of the complexity of it all. It is scientists and the World Health Organization at the center of all of that who are providing information, but there are also huge influences from social media, from journalists, from the media broadly, and from government, and very importantly, from community leaders. And the people who are receiving it are all different groups of people. There's policymakers and international organizations, but there's individuals and communities and community leaders. So the information is a complex network. We ask ourselves the question again, are the people listening to the scientists? And where is the voice of the scholarly community? Here we are speaking about this, and I ask myself often, where is the voice of the scholarly community, and is it loud enough? We need to provide that information in a number of different ways. It's fine to be giving presentations and putting it on social media and publishing in the academic journals, but the broad public needs it in different ways. And here are some of the different ways in which we can share information. And I use this one because I was involved in the national report on the government's response to communication, to the COVID epidemic, and in particular the communication section. And it's very obvious that the majority of information that was the furthest reaching actually was on things like billboards, advertising, packaging, pamphlets and leaflets, and community radio particularly. In fact, we have been saying to ourselves in that group, if you really want to make sure that information reaches the corners of the country, give it to the delivery companies, give it to the SA breweries, give it to the companies who deliver drugs to clinics, and put it on pamphlets and packaging, and people will see it. So we do need to bear that in mind. What don't we need, and what people don't need, is disinformation and misinformation and fake news. I won't say too much about it, but there has been a kind of epidemic of fake news, and that goes to accessing information which is not necessarily of good quality. But if we don't have evidence-based knowledge, and this is a quotation from the president of the Academy of South Africa, Professor Jonathan Jansen, writing about vaccines and education, saying if we don't have evidence-based knowledge on vaccines made available for everybody, then that space will be filled up very rapidly with lies and misinformation and conspiracies. So there's our responsibility. What do we need in the future? We need to build trust. We also need to build effective communication systems, tackle disinformation, strengthen official roles, and we need communication strategies for providing advice, evidence-based, fit for purpose, flexible, and so on. And there's many documents that have been reported. This is one report on the lessons learned and how to go forward. The key is about building trust in that information. We do also need clear messages from government. We've had quite a few unclear messages and presentations, and our public have been very confused. But if we have regular communication, we will enable the implementation of policies, and there will be benefits to be derived from compliance. It's about people understanding why. That information needs to be accessible everywhere, and that's the information that people will accept, and it will govern how they behave. So science journalists have a role to play there, and so do we, the experts, who need to speak out more. What are the opportunities we have? Well, we have the opportunity of what I've been talking about, the fact that science is changing and we're in this data-intensive world. We have technologies to assist us. Artificial intelligence is being one of those. We have the open science and open access opportunity, which allows us to make all of this information available to our public. We also have the opportunity to engage in a co-creative way, inclusive way of including our communities, our government role players, and other stakeholders when we design our research, before we do it, and as we do it. And all of that adds up to science engagement, which is about having conversations. Scientists need to express opinions as well as take on responsibilities. People are very interested in the opinions that we have, and therefore we need to make them available. We need to express our opinions as well as simply reporting our data in academic publications. I know many academics fold their arms at this point and say, I'm not really very interested in that kind of conversation. But there are responsibilities there, and there are ways in which we can do it. Those conversations that need to be more inclusive. It's not only about publication in academic journals, but it's about workshops, it's engaging with the community, with business, with industry. It's about networking. It's about providing, for example, exhibitions and cultural information, as well as hard data. This just indicates some of the ways in which that is the most influential. So having public workshops, having public dialogues, all of that will enable us to be more inclusive with the conversations and to communicate more with impact. And I just want to say as a last thought, this is not all about the pandemic. There are other issues that are related that we also need to communicate in the context of the pandemic, but also in the context of our decade, of the century, and of our environment. So let us remember that not only has the pandemic had an influence on our way of life, but we also need to consider education and the impact that we have experienced in terms of the digital divide, and how we can help with quality education by considering that digital divide and addressing it. Then there's the fact that COVID-19 has really put a lens on mental health, and particularly the mental health of young people, something else that we should be considering. COVID-19 doesn't discriminate, but our societies do. This is a quote from a UNICEF report, and it is true that we still need to address the issues of many types of different discrimination. And finally, climate change. And here is the next, or actually the current, planetary crisis that is not going to wait. It is already happening, and we know that we really do need to have increased awareness at the same level as we have. And here's, I think, an important parallel. Almost everybody you can think of knows a bit about COVID-19. They may not know all of the science, but they certainly know how it's impacted on their lives. And we, I think, should be asking ourselves the question, does everybody have the same awareness of climate change? And is this the next planetary crisis that we as scientists should be addressing in our communication and in the ethical way in which we do research? And let me just go to one. This is the second last slide, and it is a very specific one. I think it's about the message right now, and that is about stopping the next pandemic before it starts. And I quote here a report from the director of the World Health Organization, speaking about the next crisis and what the world needs to prepare. And here's a summary of what that report says. It says we need more research and more global surveillance. It says we need more data. We need things like vaccine platforms, but we also need coordination, more community engagement, and more communication, and more primary health care. I think that's a salutary lesson, considering how much we've talked about with all the research we've done, and we are still saying, actually, we need more. So finally, as a conclusion, let us consider our role as leaders in science. Our role is one of enabling. We need to enable our scientific communities and our broader communities to identify value, to appreciate what we consider to be good science, and to appreciate that we are conducting ourselves and providing high quality ethical science through ethical practices. And I think we need to enable all of our stakeholders, not just our colleagues, but all of our partners, to evaluate that research and to evaluate the integrity of our research. And finally, I just would like to say, I'm representing the Royal Society largely in this talk, also ASAF. We all stand for these values as scholarly societies. The importance of exchange of ideas, excellence, scholarship, international cooperation, expert advice. And here it is, independent expert advice on important matters which require scientific analysis. So ladies and gentlemen, if I have said nothing else today, I think it is that. I think we need to consider very, very important the expert advice that we can give and the fact that our public trusts us to do that. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer any questions or receive any comments that you have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. Are there any questions? If you have questions, please raise your hand in the with the reactions button at the bottom, then I can give you the floor to ask your question. Or otherwise, I can start with a question. I'd like to hear your opinion on, so for open access publishing, there's actually a strange scenario there where the publishing companies start to earn more money the more they publish, because now instead of getting paid by subscriptions, they get paid by the number of publications that they produce. So, in your opinion, could that have an impact on scientific quality?
Thanks, Bert. The short answer is yes, but let me just frame that in a slightly different way. If you take a look at the whole global publishing world, the models have been generated which show that if we collected all of the money that we are currently paying for subscriptions, or that have been in the past paid for subscriptions, that amount of money is sufficient to pay for the cost of open access publishing. And the lobby for open access publishing is essentially that that's the model we should be trying to address. It should not be that publishing companies are earning more money because we are paying to publish, because there should be the balance. There should be the fact that overall, the balance is achieved, that what we pay for the publishing in a different way, but that it is not more expensive than paying to subscribe. And the benefit of it, and here's the point about your question about quality. It's about what I was saying, is how do we measure and demonstrate quality and ethical quality in research? And that is about how we allow our public to be informed. I think that we can guard against and eventually ensure quality. I think we can manage that if we make sure that we maintain some kind of peer, and I say peer review carefully, review of the quality of data and the quality of interpretation. I don't think we stand to lose too much quality, but I think the real question is about the ethics of profits in publishing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all about ethics, especially in that case.
Yeah.
Okay, there's another question. David Fraser, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Stephanie. It was a fantastic talk and extremely timeous. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, don't you think there's a dichotomy of pressures between wanting to have your material in the open publication, the open access realm, versus the kudos and the merits that you get from publishing in a Springer or Elsevier, and the pressure to go closed for academic credence versus open is extremely high, and I think is a problem, because as you and I know, in the closed journals, our average publications get read once or twice in their entire lifetimes across the span of all that we publish. So we are plainly not meeting our objectives if that's the case. And then if it goes into the open access domain, we definitely need, don't you think, some means of interpretation of what's done. I mean, for example, you'll get a wonderful paper published in Nature, but it requires interpretation for the man in the street. So the role, as you said, of scientific journalists who are well trained to be able to interpret that in a way that is intelligible is also very important. What do you make of those points, Stephanie? Thank you.
Thank you, David. And you made several points there, all of them very valid. So let's go back to the idea of the dichotomy between open access publishing and academic, for want of a better word, academic publishing. I there is definitely a dichotomy there. And increasingly, I see a trend towards a kind of altruism about putting information into the public domain rather than that risk, which you correctly identify, of it never touching science, nobody ever knowing that you did that work. And I think there's a kind of conscience about it. Scientists have the view that if the research is important for the public and to improve quality of life, for example, for the benefit of society, maybe it is better to have it out there in the public domain than to have the, as you say, the kudos for the high impact publications. I don't think the two are completely mutually exclusive, but there is a difference. And I think perhaps what we need is a different measure. You know, we are very much victims of our own system of measuring impact. I mean, all of us look at our impact journal statistics and so on. And of course, with things like performance criteria and promotion criteria, those kind of things have a pressure on the academic system. So we do need a change. We need to take a different view of what is value for the information that we have. And it is about interpretation. But you mentioned another point, which I think is critical. And that's why I say I don't think this is a complete dichotomy. We can publish for the academic community in our journals, but we also need the interpretation. And increasingly, you mentioned science journalists. I think we all become our own science journalists at some stage. We need to be able to interpret that for the broader public. And that's a kind of new responsibility, I think. And I think more and more scientists are taking that on. So I don't think it's a mutual exclusion so much as a different way of doing things. And I hope that the academic system will change too, in terms of, for example, performance measurement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Looks as if not.
May I ask a second one? Would you mind?
Definitely,
sure.
Definitely. Go ahead.
Thank you. One of the problems that many editors of journals find, my wife is an editor of the South African Chemistry Journal, and the problem is finding adequate reviewers who are skilled and have the time and the inclination to do proper meritorious comparisons of the material so that you can actually make sure that the journal is up to par. And because there's no real credit in doing it, it's a labor of love that all of us do. It's something that people reluctantly do, and it's the last thing on their list. If they've got time, they'll get round to doing the review. Whereas that's the very nub of the ethics that we're talking about and making sure that it works. And one of the only other ways of trying to systematize this is to use alternative methods like AI and open publishing like the Wikipedia type model, where you get open arbitration of issues and tearing down of articles that don't meet peer standards. So maybe some hybrid model might need to be looked at. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. It's perhaps at the crux of that, and I am involved in the editorial boards of a couple of our other national journals, and I understand the problem, particularly if there isn't a benefit for reviewers in doing the reviews. It's no longer it's no longer regarded as a kind of privilege to do that reviewing, which is a pity, because I think people get experience from it. But the quality of the journal is dependent on the quality of those reviews. And that trend that I mentioned of putting an article into the public domain before review, but also having peer review, maybe takes a different kind of editorial activity. And that's where I think the center might rest, is the way in which editors manage this. I don't have a formula for you. I wish I did, because we need it for many journals. But we do need a system where the editorial activity takes into account the criticisms or the comments that are made in the public domain, as well as in the classical peer review. And I hope that very soon our system will develop something along those lines. And I fully agree with you that artificial intelligences may well be one of the ways in which we can do that.
Andy, your question.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. It's been a really interesting talk, hearing some more about some of this. And just following up on that last point, so would you envisage a good scenario being something like the EGU, the model that's been adopted by a lot of the EGU journals, where there's open access, they're overseen by an editor, a couple of reviewers are invited to not provide anonymous reviews that they may or may not choose to sign, but it all happens in the open and anybody is allowed to chip in and provide comments and feedback on what is effectively a preprint, that the editor can see those comments and maybe request the authors incorporate or address, or it's up to the editor to determine whether to insist that the authors incorporate that, or the authors might just decide to do it of their own accord. Do you see that as a really good model?
I think it's actually, as you say, the existing model, and I think it is a good one, because I put yourself in the place of the author. If you have put a paper into the public domain on an open access platform, and you receive many comments, the ones that you will perhaps want to hear or listen to may be the ones from the experts, and you can probably identify those from the nature of the comments. I also would quite like the issue of review not to be anonymous. I think it's a pity if it is. You know, at the moment, our peer review system is anonymous. You don't know who the reviewers are, unless you happen to know your field that well that you know who it is who's commenting, even if you don't see their name. But I think that there's an openness which should bring with it the honesty of an opinion which you express as a reviewer in your own name rather than anonymously. And I think that would also help. But I do think that this is the way it's going to go, that there will be open comment, and there will have to be some sifting of the quality of those comments and the relevance of them. I think that's the challenge for academics, for researchers.
Thank you. Further questions? Well, if there are none, then thank you all for attending. David, you got one last question.
Sorry,
No
it's I sat and made a page of notes here when you were talking, Stephanie. It's triggered so many wonderful thoughts. So thank you. So please excuse me if I ask one more.
No, go ahead.
In terms of the data models for data sharing, I think one of the things we could do potentially very well in is using some of the existing data models that industry uses for data sharing, because we don't need to reinvent methods of data privacy and protection of information, because that's out there, that's already out there and systematized. There are extrinsic pressures like the POPI Act and CPA and others that are also pressures on the quality and the method of retention of data. But we should be looking for standard methods of doing attribution of values to the data sources that the primary researchers, an extended group, and then the public can actually see as versions of the same set of data. And that those systems are all in place in industry already. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I don't think it's a case of we need to necessarily reinvent. In fact, well, yes, one can perhaps adapt. There may be necessity to adapt a little bit. I think that the key in terms of data sharing is actually about education, about training researchers in how to manage that. You know, when you consider, and I admit to finding it daunting myself. You consider the size of big data sets. I mean, we don't manage them manually anyway, but the constraints around them are very daunting. And I think that we need to incorporate into the training that we provide for researchers how to manage. And increasingly, that data science is becoming an absolute key. If we have that, and we know that there are systems available, and as you say, there are many systems available for managing data, then it's a case of using the most appropriate one. And I fully agree. We don't necessarily need new models. I do think, and I'm aware that there are one or two people in the audience who can do this, we need fundamental modelers to help us to make sure that the models we use, for example, the industry models, actually are doing what we think they are doing. And that's not necessarily a foregone conclusion. So we need understanding of how models work. Not something that I'm an expert in, but there are experts.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that, I'd like to close. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for a very interesting talk, and for everybody to be here and participate in the discussion. And we'll see you next week for the next webinar.